This simple shape has thus rid itself of the unrest of endless individuation, both of its nature element, which only qua universal essence is ruled by necessity, but in its existence and activity is open to contingency, and of the nation, which dispersed into particular spheres of activity and individual centers of self-consciousness, has an existence which is manifold in meaning and activity. All this individuation has been got rid of by this simple form and brought together into an individuality that is at rest. This individuality is, therefore, confronted by the moment of unrest. It, the essence, is confronted by self-consciousness, for which, as the birthplace of that unrest, nothing remains except to be pure activity. What belongs to the substance, the artist gave entirely to his work, but to himself as a particular individuality, he gave in his work no actual existence. He could impart perfection to his work only by emptying himself of his particularity, depersonalizing himself and rising to the abstraction of pure action. In this first immediate production, the separation of the work from his self-conscious activity is not yet restored to their unity. The work by itself is not, therefore, actually an inspired work. It is a whole only together with its genesis. The common element in a work of art, that is, that it's produced in consciousness, made by human hands, is the moment of the notion existing qua notion, which stands in contrast to the work. And if this notion, whether in the shape of artist or spectator, is unselfish enough to declare the work of art to be its own self, absolutely inspired, and to forget himself as performer or as spectator, then against this we must stick to the notion of spirit, which cannot dispense with the moment of being conscious of itself. This moment, however, stands contrasted with the work because in this initial duality of itself, spirit gives the two sides their abstract, contrasted characters of action and of being a thing, and their return into the unity from which they proceeded has not yet come about. Paragraph 708 is the beginning of an important transition that is happening in this subsection of religion in the form of art, this section, the abstract work of art. We're going from something that is more abstract to something that is more concrete, you could say, but not concrete ultimately in merely a visual sense or an individuating sense, but in a spiritual, geistige sense, as we're going to see happening in just a few paragraphs from now, namely 710. 708 begins by referring to a simple shape, and we could say, well, why talk about a simple shape? How is that a proper transition from paragraph 707, which began, or actually ended, with shapes, plural, right? Shapes that only dimly recall these titans, no longer creatures of nature, lucid ethical spirits as self-conscious nations. We have a plurality there, and that's going to be reflected in a plurality being discussed in terms of those self-conscious nations. So what is this simple shape, this gestalt that we're dealing with here? Well, we're going to have to see that developing through the rest of the paragraph. First, he tells us that it has rid itself of the unrest, the Unruhe, right, of endless individuation. So this is important. Unendliche Vereinzelungen, a process in which it's individuating itself over and over and over again, right? Without reaching a single work of art, a single shape, a single structure that can become the object of the cult, or at least a differentiated but systematized pantheon as well. So how does it get rid of this? What is it getting rid of? He says both of its nature element, and we've seen this being discussed already, which only qua universal essence is ruled by necessity, but in its existence and activity, those are two important terms there, right? In its doing, its activity, its Tätigkeit, but also in its existence, its Dasein, is ruled by contingency. So we've got this weird kind of contradiction here. Everything that is natural appears in its essence, in its broad strokes, we could say, to be ruled by necessity, Notwendigkeit. It has to be that way. And yet, why does it have to be that way in this time, in this place, in these combinations? Well, that's total contingency. So we're not getting the necessity that we thought we were getting and we wanted to have, and that can be pointed out by those who are the artists themselves or critics of them, and then we move on to another phase, right? And we've already seen this well discussed both in this section and in the previous section. He goes on and says, and of the nation, the people, the folk, right, which dispersed into particular spheres of activity and individual centers of self-consciousness. So spheres of activity, Massen, just, domains, we could say, and centers of self-consciousness, Punkte, the points, each person within a particular institution, domain. It could even be like a clan structure or something like that. Occupational, caste, whatever it happens to be. Each person is a point of self-conscious activity. We've got this vast differentiation happening within the ethical nation that's being hopefully depicted by the statuary or paintings or whatever it is that we've got going on here. He says these all have an existence, a Dasein. So again, Dasein is coming up, which is manifold in meaning, Sinn, right, and activity, Tun, in what it signifies and what it accomplishes, what it does, what it intends. So this is all part of endless individuation. And we could say, well, it's not individuation in the sense that within the ethical nation, every single person is just on their own. We do have these connections in the spheres of activity, and individuals are related to each other. And similarly, in the nature element, whether it be plants or animals or crystals or whatever, they are connected to each other. But we're not getting what's going to come up later, this individuality at rest. And so he says, all of this individuation has been got rid of by this simple form and brought together into an individuality that is at rest. Now, is this again depicting what happened in the previous paragraph? It's hard to see how to fit these together that well, right? The essential being of the God is what we're looking for here, isn't it? But we wind up with the gods, plural, in 707. So he says, all this individuation has been brought together into an individuality that is at rest. So maybe it's not the God that's the individuality at rest. Maybe it's something else. He says, this individuality is therefore confronted by the moment of unrest, by opposition. It, the essence, is confronted by self-consciousness, right? Self-consciousness is comprising here a unrest that it brings to the process. Who's self-consciousness? Well, we're going to get the artist, but we're also going to get here talking about the spectator. And can we talk about there being any self-consciousness in the work of art? Not at this point yet. As a matter of fact, there's going to be a very interesting interplay here. So he says, it's confronted by the self-consciousness, which, as the birthplace of that unrest, nothing remains except to be pure activity. What belongs to the substance, the artist gave entirely to his work. And now, notice this thing that's taking place, this moment, this transition. So what belongs to the substance the artist gave entirely to the work. The work is the recipient of the labor, but also the self-conscious thought, the willing of the artist, the person who forms it. He goes on and he says, to himself as a particular individuality, right, as this artist, the person who is working with the material, who is developing things, he gave in his work no actual existence. No, does that mean that there are no traces? I mean, the most trivial one is the signature of the artist, right? But any artist, when they're working upon materials and creating a work of art, if they are a genuine artist and not just a copier, not just a Werkmeister, but a Künstler in the German terminology that Hegel's using, they are imparting something of their own creative activity, something that is individuated. But here, the more that they avoid that, you might say, contaminating the artwork, the better the artwork is going to be. And we could ask ourselves this interesting question. Can a genuine artist really avoid doing that sort of thing? He says the artist could impart perfection to their work only by emptying himself of his particularity, depersonalizing himself, rising to the abstraction of pure action, pure doing, pure creating. And this is very interesting. We have a dynamic here, and this is something that the German idealists talked quite a bit about in their aesthetics, this interplay between particularity and, we could say, individuality, especially on the part of the producer, the artist, and the universality involved in the work of art. In a certain sense, the work is a better work the more universal it is, and the less it is a work by so-and-so, a work of so-and-so. And yet, in order to bring that off, it requires not only a great amount of artistry, but you might say a sort of moral recognition and decision on the part of the artist to give to that work of art its universality without their traces. Depersonalizing themselves in the work, taking themselves, well, they put themselves entirely into the work, in one sense, taking themselves out of the work in another way. So he says, in this first immediate production, the separation of the work from his self-conscious activity is not yet restored to their unity. The work is, by itself, not actually an inspired, beseelt, right? Not an animate, not a... When we see inspired, don't think about divine inspiration in the sense of genius or, the God, what we see in Plato's Ion, where the gods, blow something with enthusiasm into the poet, and the poet thereby produces as the agent of the god. Rather, think of this in the other way, as the artist trying to make something that could be equivalent to his own or her own self in having a soul, in having animation to it, liveliness, as we talked about earlier in previous paragraphs, right? So the work by itself is not actually an inspired work. What makes it an inspired work? He says it's a whole, a ganz, right? Only together with its genesis, and genesis here is translating the German term werden, it's coming to be, it's becoming. So the artist as worker, as producer, as artisan, part of the story of the work of art that gives it its being ensouled is its retention of connection, what we might call its provenance, right? Or the marks, the indices by which it retains this connection to its maker. It is not yet independent on its own. So he says the common element in a work of art, that it is produced in consciousness and made by human hands is the moment of the notion existing qua notion. This is very interesting. Begriff, right? Begriff is notion, or we could translate it as concept. And here, he doesn't just say the notion as notion, right? The notion qua notion, wie Begriff, but rather existierendin, existing as the notion. So the notion is, you could say, intensified in this way. The notion existing, standing out as notion, which stands, he says, in contrast to the work. And so the notion is in this weird triangulated space between those human beings who are connected with the work, one by producing, one by, we might say, acknowledging, using, consuming, which could also include the artist as well. And then we have the work of art itself, and the notion is what is connecting them. But the notion is on the side of the artist and, as he says, the spectator, right? He says, if this notion, whether in the shape of artist or spectator, is unselfish enough to declare the work of art to be in its own self absolutely inspired and to forget himself as performer or spectator, then against this we must stick to the notion of spirit, which cannot dispense with the moment of being conscious of itself. Now that's a very interesting sentence there, is it not? There's a lot of stuff going on there. So first off, notice that he says the notion could be in the shape of the artist, or it could be in the shape of the spectator. And then there's a third option, us, right? The phenomenologist who can oppose to either of these. And notice what the artist or the spectator can both do. Assume the work of art to be inspired, even though it's not in itself inspired. It's being inspired by all the other things that are going into it. It's Werden, it's Genesis that comes along, you could say, for the ride or as part of its history. So we should also say, wait a second, we've been talking about the artist until this point. Why are we bringing the spectator in here? Well, because the spectator is the end user, the one who is going to worship. The artist could be dead 5 generations, and yet that statue that they created that is within the temple, painted, the object of cult devotion and, festivals and things like that, is still being used by the spectator. So the spectator or the artist can also forget themselves as performers or spectators. And here's where we do get something like the notion of inspiration, enthusiasm, rather than merely being animate. The artist can forget themselves in their activity. They can move on to the next artwork. They can lose so much of themselves in it. The spectator, by being part of the worship of the image of the God, can also lose themselves as well, and the work of art can assume prominence here. And then Hegel tells us, watch out for this. We must stick to the notion of spirit. What's the notion of spirit? Well, at least in the religion section, spirit conscious of itself, spirit as self-consciousness, right? So he goes on and he says, this moment stands contrasted with the work, because in this initial duality of itself, spirit gives the two sides their abstracted, contrasted characters of action and of being a thing, and their return into the unity from which they proceeded has not yet come about. So if they do happen to lose themselves, artist or spectator, in the work of art for a while, it's going to fall apart because both of them are doing. One is doing by acting, one is doing by perceiving, by relating itself in worship. And the work of art there is providing, you might say, a fixed artistic point for religion. The artist then learns in his work that he did not produce a being like himself, From it, it is true, there comes back to him a consciousness in the sense that an admiring crowd reveres it as the spirit, which is their own essence. But this inspiration, since it returns to him as self-consciousness only as admiration, is rather a confession to the artist that the inspired work is not on the same level as himself. Since his work comes back to him simply as joyfulness, he does not find therein the painful labor of making himself into an artist and of creation, nor the strain and effort of his work. Furthermore, the crowd may judge the work or bring it offerings and do it with their own consciousness in whatever way it may be. If they, with their knowledge, set themselves above it, he knows how much more his act is than what they understand and say. If they put themselves below it and recognize in it the essence which dominates them, he knows himself as the master of this being. In paragraph 709, we are continuing this discussion of this, we could call it tripolar relation between the artist, the work of art, and what in the previous paragraph Hegel called the spectator, but now in this paragraph we see no longer just a single spectator, but an admiring crowd, or multitude is another way of translating it. It could even be translated pejoratively as, a mob or something like that. Verwundernde Menge, right? Verwundernde, it doesn't have a pejorative connotation to it. They're admiring, they're, seeing this work of art as something great, and thereby also the artist, if they are attuned to where it's coming from. And there's another thing that's going on here as well. We saw the term beseelte come up in the previous section as an adjective. Ensouled is a literal way of translating it, animate, or we could also translate it as inspired, right? And this inspiration now is being talked about as a noun, So there's we could call it a concentration, if not a substantivization of what's happening there in terms of inspiration, and asking about whether, in fact, the work of art is inspired. So he goes on and he says, the artist learns in his work he did not produce a being like himself. That is the beginning, and that is also the conclusion of this section. The artist is, in a certain sense, above the work of art, which in a way could be a failure on the part of the artist. If the goal is to produce an artifact that would be a sufficient vehicle for the divine, for the God, then if you're left with a statue that is not a being, a vasen in this case, like the artist, maybe there's actually a problem here rather than a success. Depends on what the artist is looking for, doesn't it? Hegel doesn't really go into this, but perhaps you could have an artist who's, all about, I want to be the one who creates, and my works of art, none of them should be equal to me. But in many cases, artists, at least in the classic sense, they want to produce something at least as good, if not greater than themselves, right? So he goes on and he says, from it, meaning the work of art, it is true, there comes back to him a consciousness in the sense that an admiring crowd, right, the spectator, reveres it as the spirit, which is their own essence. And again, we see this word Wesen coming up. Being essence, the work of art offers that to the artist who created it and to the admiring crowd who is not just looking at it, but using it as a reference point for their religious activity. So an admiring crowd reveres it, but reveres it as what? As the image of the God who's like so far beyond us and is, so much better than us, as in the unhappy consciousness, that we're just miserable worms or crap in relation to it. No, as their own essence. I mean, here we are talking about the ethical folk, the ethical people, the ones who identify Athena as their own, or Poseidon as their own, or Apollo as their own, and are happy to have the statuary in the temple created by the artist. So he goes on and he says, this inspiration, right? So here we get Beseelung, this inspiration that's supposed to be happening here, because it returns to the artist, it returns to them their self-consciousness only as admiration, is rather a confession to the artist that the inspired work is not on the same level as themselves. Notice what we're not getting here, right? We're getting admiration. Is that the same thing as Hegelian recognition, Anerkennung? It is not. Admiration is something that you can give to an artist. You can say, oh man, I listen to your albums all the time. You're such an amazing group. And you can send out fan mail and you can do all these sorts of things. But it's not the same thing as being recognized, being acknowledged by somebody who would equally be an artist and can appreciate what you're doing there. Aristotle actually picks out something like this in relation to honor in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, where he says, do you want to be honored by everybody? I mean, does it matter if you're being honored by a whole bunch of people who have no idea whether you're actually good at what you do or a good person or not? No, you want to be honored by those who actually have something on the ball, so to speak, and can say, yeah, your work is really good. And you're like, oh, coming from you, that's really quite important. Whereas coming from, average Joe on the street, or as we used to joke around in French, the Canadian French equivalent of that is Jacques Matras, right? Joe Blow, we would say in English. Who cares what they think? Right? Who cares what that admiring crowd thinks? They might not have much to offer, right? So he says it's a confession to the artist that the inspired work is not on the same level as himself. Now here he says something really interesting. Since his work comes back to him simply as joyfulness, Freudigkeit, right? A being joyful in having produced the work of art, there are some things that are not being represented or reflected here. What in the previous paragraph was called the genesis, or in German, the Werden of the work of art. And there's two things that Hegel is picking out here. This painful labor, right? Painful labor of what? Of making himself into an artist. Bildung, of cultivating oneself. Bildung is an interesting term here. It means cultivation. It also means shaping, developing, right? Sort of like what's being done with the work of art, but by the artist to themselves, making themselves into the kind of thing that could, in fact, do art. And what else? And of creation, Zeugung, right? So we've got one side here, the things the artist has done to themselves to make themselves into an artist. And this could be a continual, ongoing activity. And then there's the making the work of art, the strain and effort of work, Anstrengung seiner Arbeit, right? It's not fun to make things. It's a lot of work to produce works of art, right? Not only the work that you needed to get there to even be capable of it, but the work that you have to put into it. And the admiring crowd, the audience, the spectators, they often don't know that. I was just reading a book, this is a bit of a digression, but I think this gets us across, about the band Van Halen. Long before they had a record contract, even before they were really making it in the club scene, the brothers Alex and Edward Van Halen were practicing as a band, and whoever else they happened to have. After a while, they got David Lee Roth, but for a long time, they had just a bassist that would sing with them, or other people like that. Before they got that, they would practice 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. And they're working on works of art, sometimes other people's works of art, getting down cover songs that they would play, sometimes developing their own original songs that they were going to play as well, doing it over and over and over again. That's craftsmanship. That's what's required. When you see people doing sculpture, It's not like they just did 3D printing. They had the image of it and all out it comes. No, they have to chisel away over and over again, day after day after day. Some paintings take weeks to do, maybe even months, maybe years. None of that is reflected in what the crowd, even if they watch some biopics or Behind the Music or anything, none of that is something that the crowd can usually appreciate. You have to have some involvement in the world of art yourself in order to get that, I think Hegel would say. So he says, the crowd may judge the work or bring it offerings and do it with their own consciousness in whatever way it may be. If they, with their knowledge, set themselves above it, the artist knows how much more his act is than what they understand and say. If they put themselves below it and recognize in it the essence which dominates them, he knows himself as the master of this being. So whichever way the crowd goes, placing themselves above or below the work of art, the artist knows themselves to be above both the crowd and the work of art. And so we're placed here again with a kind of conundrum. What kind of art were we aiming at? Were we aiming at ensouled, inspired art? If that's the case, then the visual plastic arts that we've been working with are not adequate to that task.